In a previous lecture, I made the largely unsupported, but quite confident claim that most prose examples in most guidebooks devoted to grammar, writing, or prose style come from writers who lived before the 20th century, in many cases, long before the 20th century. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, since those examples generally do offer very useful models of classic sentence patterns. However, there is every reason for us to remember that 21st century readers may have very different expectations and values than did their counterparts in earlier centuries. Cultural factors and the dominant cultural atmosphere are just as important today for the shaping of prose style as were attitudes toward science in the Renaissance or attitudes toward reason in the Enlightenment. While it may still be too early to say with any confidence how prose style has changed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, make no mistake, it has changed. Most obviously, we need to note the 800-pound digital gorilla that now sits in those 19th century drawing rooms where readers engaged in the prose of their day. I am, of course, referring to the fact that computers in general and computer-enabled, if not computer-driven writing protocols are almost certainly in the process of changing the way we experience and think about prose style. More specifically, the World Wide Web has accustomed us to the hypertext link where any word or phrase in a sentence can be hot-linked to a backtext that can add detail or examples to, or even just explore loose associations with, material in the front text we are reading on a web page. And of course, email, the web, the blogosphere, and computer presentation programs, such as the ubiquitous PowerPoint, encourage us to embellish our prose with graphics and to animate it, making our pages and even our sentences appear and disappear on the screen, employing all the transitional effects of cinema, jump cuts, fades, dissolves, etc. Indeed, digital artist Eric Lawyer, in flash-driven online work such as Chroma, Lair of the Marrow Monkey, and most strikingly in his hollow-bound book, has literally animated language itself, giving sentences a kinetic dimension as the words on the screen display numerous kinds of motion. I'm going to reserve extended consideration of the effect of computers on prose style for a future lecture, but I wanted to raise the topic of electronic textuality here as part of a reminder that the prose we write and read, the sentences we craft, reflect larger cultural changes that may at first seem far removed from nuts and bolts writing concerns. For instance, the sentences we write and read today have been shaped at least in part by their participation in or resistance to the cultural dominance of first modernism and then postmodernism. I opened this course with a reference to Gertrude Stein, and while few of us aspire to write like Gertrude Stein, her experiments with language, along with those of her fellow modernists such as James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and many, many other modernist pioneers, have radically changed our expectations for literary narrative right down to the level of the sentence, where Hemingway and Faulkner give us striking examples. And now, we are 80 to 100 years past the heroic days of modernism, and possibly even past postmodernism. Postmodernism would be a subject for a lecture series in its own right, so I mention it only briefly and in passing here. But I want to suggest that this cultural dominant has also had an impact on language use. Postmodernism has been shaped in great part by developments in technology, particularly media technologies, such as film and television and computers. Unlike modernism or romanticism, postmodernism is an era or a set of prevailing cultural values and assumptions rather than being an organized movement. In fact, it's not even a monolithic set of beliefs or attitudes, but a combination of trends in a broad range of areas, including art, literature, architecture, pop culture, and many other endeavors that reflect the time in which they unfold. I define postmodernism as the culture of the easy edit, suggesting the extent to which advances in science and technology make it seem as if anything can be almost effortlessly edited, reshaped, recombined, from the prose we write on computers to the mixes and mashups of popular music to wildly eclectic combinations of architectural styles to the human body itself, now subject to genetic modification. In literature, postmodernism has been associated with a heightened sense of self-reflexivity, with literature turning back on itself to explore the vagaries of language and fiction as much or more as human experience, as much or more a human experience, a self-conscious recognition, if not celebration of the ways in which language constructs reality. Our words more and more doing our thinking for us, as opposed to being tools with which we express our thought. One of the most persistent themes in postmodern fiction is that the media have so saturated our consciousness that we find ourselves speaking, writing, and thinking in terms of language and formulas so ubiquitous in the media that we find ourselves more and more describing our own situations in terms of situations depicted over and over in the media. In effect, scripting our lives to follow the scripts made so familiar in news, film, and television. Fiction writers who've explored this idea would include John Barth, Robert Coover, Thomas Pynchon, Stephen Wright, Mark Lehner, Doug Copeland, to mention just a few. Just think for a moment how many situations we negotiate with language that is not our own, but that language that has become ubiquitous from repeated use on television. Consider just a few prefabricated phrases that will probably sound familiar to most of us and would certainly be part of the vocabularies of our children. How's that working out for you? Not so much. I have even seen that phrase, not so much, in print in a New York Times editorial. Other phrases like this. Good to go. That went well. I get that a lot. That's going to leave a mark. True dat. That's what I'm saying. Get her done. Keep it real. Sounds like a plan, and so on. This is certainly not a new phenomenon, as earlier phrases such as 23 skidoo, don't take any wooden nickels, or the more polemical, don't trust anyone over 30, or turn on, tune in, drop out of the 60s, or John Dean's at that point in time during Watergate remind us how easily we appropriate prefab or formulaic phrases for our own use. But the fact that we increasingly live in a mediated world in which the language of others cascades around us 24/7, to borrow another of those prefab terms, means that more and more of us use these expressions without being conscious of how much of our thinking and speaking and writing we are outsourcing to Hollywood writers, political speechwriters, and popular celebrities. I mention this not to rail against it, but merely to suggest one of the fairly obvious and fairly harmless examples of scripting. Of much greater concern, of course, is the danger of scripting our lives in terms of mediascape narratives, thinking that our human relationships follow the patterns we see on reality shows, on sitcoms, on videos and video games, and here in popular music. But that's also a topic for another course. Here, I'm mentioning the broad idea of postmodern scripting to provide a larger context for and to move us closer to the sentence-level phenomenon I want to explore in this lecture, a phenomenon we might think of as mini-scripting, yet another way in which we lengthen our sentences to give them a greater degree of suspensiveness. In the last lecture, I detailed a range of sentence openers that promote, to greater or lesser extent, degrees of suspensiveness in a sentence. Primarily, these were conditional constructions, such as those opening a sentence with words such as if, since, because, although, when, even, and numerous combinations of those words to posit conditions that must be met before something can happen. Combinations such as even when and even if. Likewise, time markers such as until or before or after or during, when used to specify a temporal or chronological condition, will introduce phrases that ensure some degree of suspensiveness in a sentence. Here's an example. Before I enter another tennis tournament, before I risk another embarrassing first-round defeat, and before I add to the mounting evidence that my athletic days are over, I need to develop a dependable topspin backhand. In addition to the formal and largely conceptual strategies described in the previous lecture, suspensive sentences can be generated simply by starting sentences with certain words. This lecture will review those initial prompts that force us to think in suspensive terms, and it will also consider a number of other generally overlooked and certainly unremarked phrases and patterns that will automatically delay completion of the sentence's message or purpose until near its end or until its very last word. This new category of suspensive structures consists largely of phatic expressions, whose functions are more social than discursive. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. First, however, I want to briefly review the conditional words and phrases that generate suspensiveness whenever they open a sentence. If a sentence opens by positing some condition that must be met or avoided before something else can occur, then that sentence will create some degree of suspense. If the initial if clause is then followed by one or more other if clauses, if the number of preconditions grows, and if the completion of the sentence is delayed more and more by a cascade of if clauses, the degree of suspensiveness can become quite pronounced. Since there can be a veritable list of these initial conditions, one conditional clause leading to another and then another, and since even a single if clause can be stretched out to considerable length by increasing the detail of its specification, the degree of suspense or the degree of delay in sentences introduced by opening conditionals indicated by words such as if, since, because, or although can be extended to and past the point where a reader's curiosity begins to turn to impatience. Because a sentence that begins with a conditional always kicks a bit further down the road, the can of the sentence's completion, writers who understand the appeal and emphasis of suspensive syntax may deliberately extend the conditional just to make the sentence unmistakably suspensive. Okay, you get the picture, and I'll spare you suspensive examples starting with although and even clauses. But here's one starting with when used as a conditional that's simply too good for me not to share. This from Winston Churchill in his prescient 1935 assessment of Adolf Hitler. When the terrible German armies which had held half Europe in their grip recoiled on every front and sought armistice from those upon whose lands even then they still stood as invaders, when the pride and willpower of the Prussian race broke into surrender and revolution behind the fighting lines, when then that imperial government which had been for more than 50 fearful months the terror of almost all nations collapsed ignominiously, leaving its loyal, faithful subjects defenseless and disarmed before the wrath of the sorely wounded victorious allies, then it was that one corporal, a former Austrian house painter, set out to regain all. As Churchill's deliciously suspended sentence reminds us, conditional opening constructions serve much more important functions than just delaying the end of the sentence, as they specify the conditional relationships that govern much of our experience of the world. Boiled down to its propositional core, Churchill's sentence specifies, when these conditions prevailed, an Adolf Hitler became possible. In similar fashion, suspensive sentences that result from other prefab structures, such as initial infinitives used as subjects, to be or not to be, that is the question, to know him is to love him, or any form of extended noun phrase subject, serve important logical functions quite apart from creating degrees of suspensiveness, as we can see in this sentence from Macaulay's essay, actually it's a review, The Puritans, in which he strives to give the most remarkable body, quote, the most remarkable body of men, perhaps, which the world has ever produced, end quote. their rightful due, whatever the odious and ridiculous parts of their character. Here's the quote. Those who roused the people to resistance, who directed their measures through a long series of eventful years, who formed out of the most unpromising materials the finest army that Europe had ever seen, who trampled down king, church, and aristocracy, who, in the short intervals of domestic sedition and rebellion, made the name of England terrible to every nation on the face of the earth, were no vulgar fanatics. But now, I want to move from the quite meaningful suspensive structures built by conditionals and illustrated by Churchill and Macaulay to consider a very different set of prefab structures that frequently add little or no propositional meaning to the sentences they extend. These are the structures of mini-scripting. They can be found almost anywhere within a sentence, but are most frequently used to open sentences or to interrupt their flow. These are the prefab words and phrases we drop into our sentences like styrofoam packing peanuts, not so much to protect something fragile as to discourage readers from handling the goods. These are prefab words and phrases that go bump in our sentences, serving as syntactic speed bumps to slow our sentences down, inevitably making them a bit longer, inevitably making them a bit more suspensive. As unlikely as it may seem, these are words and phrases that, amazingly enough, add no discursive meaning to the sentence, in a way just marking time and taking up space, as we can see in this sentence with its gratuitous use of as unlikely as it may seem, amazingly enough, in a way, and as we can see. Some of these phrases have very little serious propositional content. Some take on what meaning they have from the context of the sentence in which they appear, and some are virtually nonsensical. For instance, we may plop down at the outset of a sentence the phrase, "It goes without saying." Here's an example. It goes without saying that Kinky Friedman, semi-serious detective novelist, sometime idiosyncratic country western singer, and full-time cornpone pundit, was not a particularly viable political candidate. Or, Kinky Friedman, semi-serious detective novelist, sometime idiosyncratic country western singer, and full-time cornpone pundit, it goes without saying, was not a particularly viable political candidate. No matter where it appears in the sentence, it goes without saying could be removed from the sentence with no loss of propositional content, but suggesting, as it does, that what is being said did not really need to be said, a somewhat paradoxical acknowledgement that just perhaps it did need to be said after all. Clearly, this phrase adds emphasis to the end of the sentence when placed just before its predicate, was not a particularly viable candidate, and clearly it prepares us for some impending truth when it's placed at the beginning of the sentence. And clearly in both positions, it delays the completion of the sentence by 4 words, thus adding slightly to the sentence's suspensiveness when used at its beginning, and serving as a more distinct speed bump when used near its end. But in the final analysis, after all is said and done, if truth be known, this phrase, much like in the final analysis after all is said and done and if truth be known, adds little or no meaning to the sentence. It is, in fact, a primarily phatic utterance, a step the sentence takes that marches in place rather than going anywhere. We get the concept of a phatic, P-H-A-T-I-C, a phatic utterance, from pioneering anthropologist and ethnographer Bronislaw Malinowski, who advanced his description of phatic communion in his essay The Problem of Meaning in Primitive Languages, published in 1923 in Ogden's and Richards's groundbreaking book, The Meaning of Meaning. While Malinowski's essay refers to primitive languages and his research focused on natives in the Trobriand Islands in New Guinea, he specifies at several points in his discussion of phatic utterances that they function in essentially the same way, whether in savage or highly civilized cultures. As he explains, quote, "Though the examples discussed were taken from savage life, we could find among ourselves exact parallels to every type of linguistic use so far discussed." End of quote. What savage and civilized cultures have in common are traditions of phatic communion, which Malinowski describes as, quote, "a type of speech in which ties of union are created by a mere exchange of words," end of quote. This is language used in free, aimless social intercourse, deprived of any context of situation. Phatic utterances such as formulas of greeting, and we all know these, "Hi, how are you, how's it going?" are not intended to inform. They're not intended to connect people in action, not intended to express a thought, but as Malinowski says, but serve to establish a common sentiment, an atmosphere of sociability. Phatic utterances frequently affirm, again, in Malinowski's words, some supremely obvious state of things. Nice day, isn't it? And begin to serve a social function just by breaking silence, since, as Malinowski also explains, the communion of words is the first act to establish links of fellowship. However, phatic utterances proceed beyond just breaking silence or invoking formulas of greeting to sustain the flow of language with purposeless expressions of preference or aversion, accounts of irrelevant happenings, comments on what is perfectly obvious. These phatic utterances may be nearly devoid of meaning. Again, in Malinowski's words, they fulfill a social function, and that is their principal aim, but they are neither the result of intellectual reflection, nor do they necessarily arouse reflection in the listener. End of the quote. Instead of serving the purpose of reflection, these phatic utterances constitute a mode of action just in their being voiced. Each utterance, Malinowski states, is an act serving the direct aim of binding hearer to speaker by a tie of some social sentiment or other. Or, as we might illustrate this phenomenon in Iowa City, how about those Hawkeyes? In short, a phatic utterance communicates not ideas, but attitude, the speaker's presence, and the speaker's intention of being sociable. Now, if we extend Malinowski's discussion of phatic speech to writing, we can see written phatic utterances as nearly content-free examples of the kind of processing I've championed in earlier lectures, a way of reminding readers they are in contact with a mind, a person, a personality, rather than with some mindlessly objective recording or reporting of data. If classical rhetoric discusses tropes that serve this exact function, I'm not aware of it, but it strikes me as a significant rhetorical and/or stylistic phenomenon that certainly deserves our attention. I've been trying to list examples of this phatic phenomenon, and my list just keeps growing. Some of the phrases it currently identifies are, "As it happens, it turns out, in point of fact, when all is said and done, my Lord, for God's sake, for that matter, in the final analysis, and whatnot, believe it or not, if you know what I mean, of course, for some reason, just between us, just between you and me, you know, to no one's surprise, as I believe is the case, it occurs to me, I suppose to my dismay, to my relief, to my way of thinking, it's important to note, it's important to remember, to everyone's surprise, I might add, I am reminded, we should remember, and I agree that it is, and I believe that it is, in my mind, to my way of thinking, after all, in spite of everything. It seems to me, I can't help but wonder, let's face it, if truth be known, just between us, if conditions are favorable, if time permits, after a fashion, if you must know, it goes without saying, almost inevitably, fittingly enough, curiously enough, amazingly enough, that is to say, I suppose, as unlikely as it may seem, one might ask, as we can see, as I pointed out, in a way, in a sense, not to mention, to some extent, to a certain extent, as is widely known, as everybody knows, you know what, let me tell you, make no mistake. Whew. In a jingoistic moment, I titled my list, Things That Go Bump in the Sentence, Syntactic Speed Bumps, Spacers and Pacers and Intensity Makers. I believe that in much the same way that phatic utterances function in oral discourse, phatic words and phrases in written discourse serve to strengthen the connection between writer and reader. While these phatic phrases can function differently in different contexts, they all seem to imply a closer relationship between writer and reader than would be the case were they not there. Most obviously, what we might call phatic connectors promote a confidential tone that suggests the writer is letting the reader in on information that's private or privileged, or that the writer is trying to effect an ingratiating honesty. To be honest, let's face it, just between us, if truth be known, if you must know, if you get right down to it, if I may call it that, I can't help but wonder, to my way of thinking, it seems to me, shall we say, phatic phrases can both raise or lower the dramatic emphasis of a sentence's propositional content, interrupting the flow of the sentence either to highlight what follows the intensifying phrase or to tone down or qualify following information. Intensifiers would be interjections such as, "My Lord, for God's sake, for goodness sake, amazingly enough," and that perennial favorite, "of course." Qualifiers would include phrases such as, "For that matter, for some reason, I suppose, after all, after a fashion, in a way, in a sense, and to some extent." In a sequence of sentences remarkable for their suspensiveness, Thomas Berger illustrates the use of a couple of different phatic intensifiers in this description of Candy Darling, the transvestite hero-heroine of several Andy Warhol films. A vulnerable maiden being brutalized by a sadistic male, this may be why the scene is actually very moving, in more ways than one, natürlich, mein Herr. But to put kinkiness aside for a moment, if that can be done when talking about, my God, a man who is girlier than many contemporary women, what one feels most here is the old moral shock of seeing an imposter in whatever realm unmasked. Phatic phrases can be used as sentence openers. As it happens, it turns out, it occurs to me, at any rate, or these phrases can be used later in the sentence as interrupters. Phatic phrases can be used to signpost important information or claims. In point of fact, in fact, it's important to note. And they can be used to clinch a conclusion in the final analysis. When all is said and done, they can be used to certify content or to undermine or decertify it. Certifying phrases might include, "and I agree that it is," to no one's surprise, it goes without saying, and as everybody knows. Undermining phrases might include, "believe it or not," to everyone's surprise. Curiously enough, one might ask, or as unlikely as it may seem. These, and countless similar examples of what I'm calling mini-scripting, might be thought of as functioning in much the same way as the ever more ubiquitous emoticons do on the web and in text messaging. While these phatic phrases may not really carry any content, they help signal to the reader both the writer's individuality and the writer's attitude toward the information delivered by the sentence. They also inevitably slow the sentence down and delay its completion, increasing at least to some extent its degree of suspensiveness. Of course, to some extent, you know you'll have some degree of suspensiveness in any sentence you open with or interrupt with to some extent. I don't call attention to these usually overlooked phatic phrases with the same conviction that William James and his student Gertrude Stein tried to call attention to usually overlooked words. But these mini-scripted phatic phrases are so prevalent in our writing that it makes no sense to ignore them. And we will revisit this concept of prefab phatic phrases in a future lecture when we'll also consider the many, many duple rhythm phrases we drop into our speaking and writing. Paired words such as willy-nilly, hocus-pocus, wishy-washy, flip-flop, ticky-tacky, doom and gloom, rough and tumble, and so on. I'm not quite sure what to call these itsy-bitsy balances, but they are, dare I say it, near and dear to my heart.